Syria has seen one of its bloodiest days in months, amid speculation that President Bashar al-Assad is being white-anted from within. It comes after an incredible development overnight in the long-running crisis. 3 top figures in the brutal Assad regime were killed in a suicide bombing. The men were the country's defence minister, the head of its crisis team, and the president's brother-in-law. To find out what's happening, a short time ago I was joined from neighbouring Lebanon by the Middle East correspondent for the independent newspaper, Robert Fisk. Robert Fisk, since March last year we've heard a number of times that the crisis in Syria has reached a tipping point. Is this finally it?
Well, I don't use tipping points or decision points for the simple reason that I think in the progression of history there are certain points where we'll look back and say that was a critical day. Yesterday was a very critical day. I mean, this was going for the jugular, and they did. The opposition to Assad to have struck down his own brother-in-law, one of the strongest, toughest men in the regime, a man blamed by the United Nations, by the way, for murdering, just behind me, the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, in 2005. But I think the point is that this has struck deep into the heart of the regime. There's now questions going out about whether Bashar Assad's brother Maha was seriously wounded. One report says he's dead, which I don't think is correct. And at the moment, of course, the president is having to go to the funeral of his brother-in-law in the northern town of Tartus on the Syrian seaboard. So I think the regime is deeply shocked. And I was talking last night to someone who was within the regime last year, and who knows Bashar very well. And he said he doesn't think he can survive now, physically survive, quite apart from politically. Could
this attack have been possible without help from inside the regime?
Well, people keep asking this question. You've got to realise the regime has already had attacks and has always had attacks from within. Remember that Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, when he was a president, there were 2 attempted coups by Bashar's uncle Rifat against his brother Hafez. In fact, Rifat was sent into exile by Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, for that very reason. He actually now lives in Mayfair in considerable luxury in London. So within the regime, within the very family, there have always been rifts and attempted coups. It'd be quite normal to expect within the regime to have people who want to kill them. I'm told that 2 weeks ago there was an attempt to poison the same 3 men, but the poisoner was so enthusiastic he put too much poison in the food and they smelt a rat, literally.
You said that your contact says that Assad can't survive physically. I mean, what do you see as his options from here?
Well, he hasn't got a lot, you see. If he wants to flee the country, let's supposing, I mean, he could send his 3 kids out and his wife, but if he wants to leave the country, it's going to be an Alawite colonel, he's an Alawite Shiite, of course, like the president is, to drive him to the airport. Now, if you were an Alawite colonel and you're sending your president into exile, what's your future? I don't think I'd take him to the airport. I think it's much more likely there would be a counter-coup before he could try and flee. He could be given some tiny position and there'd be a new strongman, dictator, brutal man take over. I think, though, that, as I say, I think the opposition now, which has clearly got foreign support, when the Syrians say a foreign hand, they're probably right. I think they're going to take him down. He may have another month. Assad is a tough guy and a ruthless man, but I think this is the end.
Will whoever takes over from Assad be a responsible government?
Well, look, here's the problem. People are coming to educated Syrians outside Syria, people who are in the armed opposition inside Syria, and saying, help us, we need you as a transition government, because we cannot control our own armed militias. You know, there are people, families around Damascus who are being bayoneted as I speak to you. There are family killings going on. And this guy actually said to a friend of mine, a Syrian friend of mine, you know, he said, if they come into Damascus, we won't be able to control them. Help us. He said, we can't run a town, let alone a country. So this is a major problem. Now, there are large groups of Syrians, I'm talking about people who know the regime, know the opposition, who are meeting in places like Jordan, Turkey, and very much here in Lebanon, who are trying to be able to find a way of getting in quickly if the regime goes and taking it over as a transitional government. One of the things they're proposing is that the various community organisations which originally set up the protests would wear some kind of special uniform identifying them with the Free Syrian Army badge, and that they would protect each community, all communities, whether they be mixed, Alawite, Alawi, Druze, Christian, Sunni, whatever. But it's going to be a tough job to do.
What do you think in this transitional period, if it happens, are the chances that Syria's chemical weapons stockpile will be used by the Assad regime as a last-ditch attempt to hold on to power, or will fall into the wrong hands?
Fall into the wrong hands. I think the latter is what the West is worried about. A Lebanese friend of mine who regularly goes to Moscow and talks regularly to Russian officials told me, and I didn't believe it before, the Russians are seriously worried that this would happen, that it would fall into wrong hands. Remember, the Russian fear over Syria is that there'll be another Chechnya, and they do not want a mimicking Islamic republic south of Chechnya, where their own Islamic irredentists have caused them a lot of trouble. I'm told there are many, many hundreds of Russian Marines in the town of Tartus, where the Russian naval base is, the same city in which Bashar has gone to bury his brother-in-law today. And these troops were put in there on three naval vessels that came in 2.5 weeks ago. And their specific job is to race across Syria and take the chemical weapons if they appear to be about to fall into the hands of rebels against the government. But whether they could do that or not, they won't be very popular, remember, if they did that. I have no idea.
Robert Fisk, thank you very much for making time to speak to us today.
You're welcome.